Well, I make my own coffee. During the pandemic, I certainly became what's called a quarista. Yeah, a
quarantine barista.
Yeah. So
this is why you're a creative.
Well, I can't live without coffee. I do make a good espresso.
I'll be right over. Hey, it's E.B. Moss, and this is episode 30 in season 2 of Insider Interviews, where you get the insider scoop on the business of media, marketing, and advertising. The scoop we all need right now is what's happening in the world of technology and AI meets creativity. And the man for the job to tell us all about that is Anthony Yell. He is the Chief Creative Officer at Razorfish, one of the most renowned digital-first agencies of all time. Anthony has spent a couple of decades working with major brands across all platforms, but he's developed quite a theory about how to connect brand purpose to business performance. It's something that is essential these days as we try to retain the human in our creativity. So I recommend that you just sit back, listen, or watch his wise words. Anthony Yell, I want to have a Vulcan mind meld with you.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
We can do this. I'm not sure how to do
is.
it, but we can try. I watch enough Star Trek to figure out. I don't have the pointy ears, unfortunately. I've got the nose, but I don't have the ears.
Thank you for understanding that.
Worries.
But I say that, in that old Star Trek reference, because, I want to have what's inside your head as this advanced being in the world of creative meets technology. You are definitely steeped in digital as a creative. One of the most renowned shops for digital meets creative, and you get to play in so many cool spaces. I truly want to be you. I want to start with 3 sort of counterintuitive things that you list in your self-description, and I want to take these one phrase at a time.
Right.
So they are would-be drummer, listener, and analog buff.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is remind myself not to put too much out there. Never mind.
Would-be drummer.
Okay, let's start with drumming. I am fascinated by rhythm in general. My observations, having traveled a fair amount, both through work and obviously my spare time, sort of doesn't matter where you go in the world. As soon as somebody starts laying down some beats, you can see people tap their toes and everybody comes together. So I've always very much appreciated the power of music as a sort of a collective mechanism for joining us all together. To be honest with you, at the core of it is, I think, always rhythm. I think that's the sort of secret source to it. And so I always admired drummers. They were sort of at the back of the band.
Yeah.
But, like without them.
Holding it together.
Yeah, basically. And there's been some epic ones. And obviously when they go to town, it's kind of crazy. So I also very much appreciated and was completely fascinated by the fact that they could get all their arms and limbs to do different things at different times. And I was just not that coordinated. So I was like, how do they do that? So I always wanted to learn how to play the drums. I didn't have an opportunity to learn how to when I was a child. And then at some point when I was actually living in Los Angeles, a good friend of mine was a decent drummer. So I did a trade with him on some like design stuff that I was doing at the time. And he promised me that he would teach me how to play the drums. But then sort of life happened. He got busy. I got busy. But I did buy a full drum kit, full analog drum kit, all the hardware, all the cymbals, everything. I didn't really know what I was doing. And I had at the time a big enough house to put it in. And then again, life happened. I got a job in New York, moved to New York, and then I had a tiny apartment and then ended up with 2 children. So the last thing that I could unpack was this enormous analog drum kit. So unfortunately, it's still tucked away in one of the closets. But my goal is to sort of reprogram my brain and my body to be able to do all the things that I've seen drummers do. And, Whiplash is just insane as a movie in terms of like watching a jazz drummer go through the
I can make an introduction to my friend Jeff Hamilton, the renowned jazz drummer, and I will add a link to my interview with his fellow bandmate John Clayton in my other podcast. It's quite a living. How's that for a little
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
interstitial?
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah,
but
no.
what's interesting to me, and you talked a little bit about this, is
Mm,
that it's in the background keeping things together. But to
yes.
me, drumming and design is a little bit different because
Yes.
one is methodical,
Mm,
you're keeping a steady beat, and then the other one is about like coloring outside of the lines when you think of design and the need
yep.
to uh, dance to the beat of a different drummer,
Yep.
so to speak.
Yeah.
So we'll come back to that because I really want to get into clearly your design part of your
Yeah.
life. But let's go to number 2,
Mm.
listening. I want to know why that's your MO, but I need to do the listening today because you
Yeah.
are the multi Clio and Cannes Lions winner designer guy. So you
Mm.
do the talking, but why do you list listening?
Well, secretly, I'm not the most extrovert person, to be honest with you. So what I've found is that my secret sauce is learning from others by listening to others. So I am
Mm.
unbelievably curious. I get myself into the most unusual conversations where I probe very intelligent people, many more intelligent people than me, around the craziest subjects. And I learn from everybody. I mean, even when I was at Max, I was talking to some brilliant people, and it was just
Mm.
fascinating to me. So I sort of step in, trigger the debate or the discussion, and then just spend an awful lot of time trying to learn from various different people's perspectives. And I think relative to the notion of creativity as a form of connecting things,
Mhm.
it is to me one of the most important things within the subject of creativity is to listen to other people's perspectives, to understand where they're coming from, so you can sort of understand what might make sense and resonate with them.
Yes,
Yeah.
perfect. And when you mentioned Max, Adobe Max, that
Yeah.
is the big creative conference, and we're going to talk about that too
Yeah.
because you did a session there yourself. But
Yes.
before we get into the groovy world of AI and tech and creativity combined, let's talk about your last self
Yeah.
attribute,
Um,
analog buff. So, for a guy at a digital shop, are you like
yeah.
calling yourself obsolete or is that an asset? Why
Um,
analog buff? And I see a little record player
yeah.
in the background. Love you
Yeah.
a little bit more.
Yeah. Um, so before I got into art and design, I sort of, this is going to sound really strange, but I kind of owe my career to Lego, if I might say that, which is sort of like the tool or toy that I had access to that inspired my imagination with connecting and building things. And because even though I don't have hopefully too much gray hair, I was sort of like in the era of digital. I always appreciated it. Plus, I appreciated what had come before it. And analog to me was always easier at the time for me to understand and was also a bit of a respite from my day job because my day job
Mm.
was sort of like clearly in all things digital. And so I would honestly just like to, on the weekends, remove myself from that reality and sort of work with my hands on making things, whether that would be
Yeah.
like fixing up old cars or building speakers or whatever it ends up being. I just like very much fascinated by the simplicity of things, and then the ability to sort of work with them, fix them up, and so on and so forth. So to me, the balance between digital and analog is also a healthy balance to have, because I think if
Yeah.
you live in one world too much, you don't really have the ability to reflect upon the world that you're in.
Love that answer, Anthony. I think I'm going to appreciate everything you said today. But case in point,
Mm,
I live near the 77th Street Flea Market. Every
mm,
Sunday, there are tons of stalls and vendors of, I mean, everything
yep,
from tapas to antiques.
yeah,
The most popular stall for each of the past Sundays that I've been there now is the analog watch reseller.
yeah,
And guess who's there? All the Gen Xers, Gen Zers are
mm,
glomming onto those analog watches. And I happened to ask one of the kids,
yeah,
why? And they said, well, they're kind of retro cool, but honestly, we're tired of screens.
Right. Yep.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
So I'm
Well,
going to
I
get rid
don't.
of my Fitbit and bring out
well,
my old
Well,
Timex.
here's an analog watch for you.
There you go.
I have a few of them. You got
Yep.
to be careful if you get into watches. It becomes a slippery slope, and you can get
It,
very obsessed very quickly.
I have a box of them, and all the batteries are dead, but
Right.
I can't give them up.
Yeah.
So speaking about evolution,
Mm.
I definitely want to get into yours and Razorfish, where
Yeah.
you are Chief Creative Officer. But I know that I don't think we overlapped, but we both lived in San Francisco.
Mm.
I was there in the 80s, heaven help me, at the corner of Haight and Ashbury when
Right.
hippies were still roaming the streets there.
Mm.
And, you talk about evolution. In my 5 years there, the methadone clinic on the corner turned into a double rainbow ice cream
Oh, there you go.
store.
Yeah.
But are you still in San Francisco or no? You moved to New York?
Yeah, no, I've been fortunate enough to live in, I think, some of the more epic U.S. cities. I do have a 415 telephone number still, so I'm still
Very cool.
representing. Yeah,
Yeah.
I viewed it
California.
as a sort of social security card number and just keep it for life. But I was there in the sort of mid '90s into the early
Okay.
2000s. So the city itself was sort of very different from what it looks like
Yeah.
today. Parts of it were less
Right.
appealing. But it was like, the nexus of creativity and technology because it was sort of like the
Yes,
beginning and early days of the internet. And
that's true.
it was just, like a wonderful place to be. When it was sort of pre the Valley taking over. So the city had an awful lot of agencies that were thriving within it. The design community was thriving within it. And we would all sort of travel down to the valley to go talk to the big tech companies about what they were up to. But the whole peninsula sort of become one now, and
South
it's
Bay.
difficult to tell
Mhm.
where the city begins and the peninsula ends.
Well, that leads us beautifully into your evolution and then how Razorfish has changed. I'll just do that
Yeah.
listening that I
Yes,
promised.
yeah. So it's kind of funny. Like, not many people know this, but we did actually retire the Razorfish brand for a period of time
Mhm.
between 2018 and 2020. And then for various different reasons, strategically, business wise, the list kind of goes on. We rebirthed it in 2020, 3 months before the pandemic, which was quite it's quite interesting to relaunch a fairly scaled and sizable agency 3 months before we all had to sort of scarper and go home. But subsequently to that, we've been growing the business. We sort of found our way in the world. And I actually think it being retired for a couple of years was actually very, very healthy. The reason being is because it sort of afforded us the ability to sort of reboot it in a way that was more contextually relevant to today's
Mm,
world
mhm.
versus, its genesis, which was 1995. So even though agencies evolve and change over time, sometimes they can get a little stuck. So we had a sort of a breaking point, which I think was very healthy and allowed us to reflect on really what would make sense relative to its position in the world to be able to provide value to clients today versus the legacy of the agency stemming back to 1995. It's not to say that we don't celebrate that; we very much do, but there was a pause there for a few years.
What were the key elements that were part of the relaunch, the repositioning of Razorfish? I know that, you have even more new and recent additions like
Yeah,
your creator collab,
yeah.
things like that. But what did you plant a stake in the ground about in the relaunch?
Well, part of it, I think, relative to technology and creativity, was trying to bring a bit of humanity back to it. To be honest with you,
Yay.
yeah. So technology can sometimes feel a little cold. And if you lean into the future too much, there's obviously a few routes that you could go: utopian, dystopian. There's two very clear choices. And so, really, what we wanted to do was just like, yep, technology has been part of our lives. We're inextricably linked to it. Consumer behavior is dictated by emerging technology. Emerging technology births new consumer behavior, but like we want to counterbalance this where it's like in service of humanity.
Mm.
So we wanted to bring a little bit more of a human lens to the agency as we rebirthed it in 2020.
And that has made its way into your very clear position
Yeah,
of connecting brand purpose to business performance, I
yeah,
guess. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, very
Okay.
much so. Yeah, I mean, in today's
Well,
world, brand purpose as a motivation and a mechanism for getting everybody aligned to the vision of the organization and consumers sort of supportive of what a brand stands for is incredibly important. But
yes.
we've often found that it's incredibly difficult for marketers and organizations then to then translate that into the broader ecosystem. So it often feels like sort of like a manifesto like object. It's up there. But then when you walk into the store or when you start playing around with the apps or whatever it is as part of that broader ecosystem, there's a disconnect.
Yeah.
So our position and our promise to our clients is to be able to connect those two things.
I love that so much. And it's perhaps easier to do it with brands like Dove, which you
Yep.
famously evangelized their brand purpose, and that's certainly been built into their ethos and their
Yep.
communication strategy. I'm sure it's harder to connect the dots and bring out brand purpose for some others. Are there some that you're quite proud of that you're able to speak to or white label if you have to?
Yeah, well, I have to white label,
Okay.
but yeah, there's
Hypothetically, if you were a car.
yeah, basically, yeah. Well, speaking of cars,
Okay.
no, I mean, like, there's a consumer electronics brand that we've worked with extensively that had to find its place in the world, and consumer
Mhm.
electronics can be wildly complicated. But like, what's the purpose of all this stuff? We have all these devices in our lives, but really, why? And so making sure that there's an end consumer benefit that becomes sort of that pinnacle statement, and then making sure that no matter how or where you interconnect with that brand, the brand is always delivering on that promise to show you the technology is in service of you trying to achieve something. uh,
Yeah.
is something that we've been working with this large consumer electronics company for a while. But the same is true across every industry. And sometimes, the subjects in the industry, they all have their unique opportunities and challenges. But, it's really fun to do once you're trying to actually truly connect those things.
So that then leads us into what you spoke about at Adobe Max.
Mm,
I know it was called Future You and Future Proof.
yeah.
So for those of us who were not at this amazing creativity conference,
Yeah.
what's the mini download or
Yeah.
the crib notes?
Yeah. Well, so we had an unusual opportunity to present broader thought leadership at Max. The general theme at Max is sort of like brand agency. Adobe creates a body of work and then you explain it. And so we were very fortunate enough to have a different opportunity to present different perspective. So after some reflection, we came up with a synopsis of Future You, Future Proof, the creative playbook for navigating the next decade. Because
Oh,
as a creative, there's obviously a sort
please
of a
give me a
yeah,
playbook.
yeah. We find ourselves at this sort of pivotal moment where technology is influencing our industry at a rate that is, it's kind of crazy, to be honest with you. So, not only did I want to reflect on what that might look like, because it's valuable to me, you know what I mean? Listen to a whole bunch of people, learn a whole
Mhm.
bunch of stuff, but also assuage any doubts or concerns that might exist in the people that wanted to come listen to the
Yeah.
talk. Now, that being said, I quickly discovered that trying to compress 10 years into an hour is not the
Okay.
easiest thing to do. Yeah. And so, it was an epic adventure in trying to distill all these wild possibilities into a useful sequence of
Ugh.
points that would simplify some of the complexity that's out there and give people, at a minimum, a little bit of the fundamentals with which they could go learn themselves. So we treated it as a bit of a fundamental, and from that, there were enough segues in there that you could see the connectivity between all these themes that are happening. So that was
Well,
the notion of it, and then we broke
okay.
it down into 4 waves that we thought were chapters that were interesting.
Okay.
Yeah,
And can you,
yeah.
what if I gave you a minute a year? Could you do 10 years or
Well,
can
yeah.
you
So
just tell us the chapters?
yeah. Well, we didn't do it chronologically.
Okay.
We did it.
Key points.
Yeah, we did it through key waves. So the first wave was called adapting to Gen AI, sort of from hype to harnessing Gen AI for ideas and workflow.
That
Which,
would take 10 hours right there.
yeah, well, it's definitely a difficult subject because the universe of AI is expanding at a rate that is out of control. But most of the creatives in the audience, and all of us, like we are measured on sort of the effectiveness with which we can create work and the efficiency with which we can create work. And so the tools enable us to actually create bigger and better ideas. But in a world where efficiency is critical, you also have to do it faster and simpler. So it was like, how do we take all this stuff and actually make use of it, both on the individual creative side as well as the at scale commercial side?
Okay.
The next wave, I think, actually kind of a more important piece for creatives to wrap their head around, which is if wave one is really about Gen AI, and you could simplify it down to it's like a really amazing tool set and a
Hmm.
collaborator, it is still a tool. The next wave is all around new frontiers in storytelling, so embracing emerging mediums and technology, specifically AR, MR, VR, all the R's, extended reality.
Yes.
And, that to me is a medium, and it's a fundamental medium that will very much change how we communicate, how we create products and services, how everybody moves through the world. And, I am very bullish on that one in terms of like how much honestly fun it will be, but also how you need to wrap your head around thinking very, very differently. So, linear experiences, versus game design is very much sort of like a big pivot in that chapter,
Yeah.
sort of creating worlds that you move through that have narratives in them and services within them, but they are all hyper personalized and based on how and where you might move through it versus me.
Yeah.
So it gets really complicated really quickly, but it's going to be super awesome. And then, okay, well, if wave one is about limitless creativity and wave two is about mixed reality, then wave three was all about next gen tech, which will power it all, both in terms of the ability to render all of these hyper immersive in near real time experiences, as well as other technologies that will change how you can move seamlessly between those worlds.
So the tools that enable the first two or
Yeah,
the
well, yeah.
evolution
So
again.
basically, GPU, CPU, network speeds, things like neural interfaces. Where like one of the points in the presentation is like right now we're all trying to navigate AVPs and other tool sets using our hands. But if you believe in the future of neural interfaces, you don't have to do that. You just think, and something will happen.
Holy moly.
Yeah.
Well, I
So
guess we're already seeing that applied for some differently abled people
yeah.
or accident victims, et
Oh yeah.
cetera,
It has
which is
yeah. No, it's got a
always
wonderful
is
array of
heartwarming.
yeah, wonderful array of positive benefits. And
Yeah.
if you saw Zuckerberg go on stage a couple of weeks ago, I happened to be at MetaConnect. He introduced the Orion glasses, but he also introduced the latest version of the Control Labs neural interface. And it's
Yeah.
way more miniaturized now, 6 years later, than it was in 2018.
Incredible. I
Yeah.
have a friend who is working on their current stage meta glasses and
Mm,
the retail display aspect of it. I
yeah.
cannot get a friends and family discount though.
Oh, right, right, right. Yeah. Well, I
You
have
must
two.
have a lot of cool toys.
Well, I have two Meta Ray Bans right here. Yeah, they're
Damn.
fun. They're fun, but
Wow.
there's also some challenging sides to them too. And then the last wave was like with all of this, where you might be immersed in this hyper real, immersive world where it's difficult to discern what's real versus fake, plausibly. That's hyper personalized and all these other bits and pieces. Wave four was about creating with conscience. So we
Oh,
dove
thank goodness.
into we dove into real versus fake, convenience versus privacy, and then sort of the notion of hyper personalization versus eco conscious personalization.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
so it's
now we're
good.
talking my language. Good. Okay. I do always like to ask my guests about their definition of use of brand purpose or
Mm.
personal brand purpose. You walk that talk every single day on behalf of brands, but how do you see it applied in the world of AI? How do we need to be considering um, balancing that conscientiousness and sustainability? When we look at trying to personalize things and even
Mm.
the cost of energy
Yeah,
to have many file sizes and versions,
yeah.
you answer that however you like in
Well,
whatever
I
area.
have some fun facts
Oh,
again
good.
from the presentation. You might not believe this, but apparently,
Okay.
plus or minus maybe a trillion or two, there's going to be 12 trillion pieces of marketing content created next year.
Stop it.
Yep, globally. So, if you do the math, divide that by 365, you get 36,876,000,000 per day. So yeah, the industry as a whole uses a fair amount of energy. I won't get into the stats. I have them in my head. The
So,
good news is, like relative to AI and the models creating more at scaled content, they're all getting way more efficient.
mhm,
So the implications are actually less challenging as you look into the future. However, the balance is if we choose not to make less stuff. But I think what will happen
right.
is we'll probably choose to make more stuff. So then it becomes a little bit of a race between the efficiencies of the machines to make more against the demand that we all have of more.
Right.
Yeah.
I was at a conference myself last week, and I heard Jay Altshuler from MasterCard remind us that storytelling is really key and
Oh,
targeted
yeah.
placement is really key because we're exposed now to some 20 to 30,000 messages a day.
Yeah.
And so I can't even imagine with the increase that you're talking about and the capabilities of cranking out an
Yep.
almost infinitesimal number
Yep.
of versions. This is head exploding emoji for
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
who are listening instead of watching. So, all right, that aside, we need creative that breaks through.
Yep.
And that's kind of your job.
Yeah.
How do you help your team stand out and navigate? What are best practices in storytelling these days with all of these tools and options and strategies, Anthony?
Well, I think the thing that our teams always focus in on is really just understanding what's available to them relative to the emerging technologies. And certainly also understanding, emerging behaviors that would be born from it. So we spend an inordinate amount of time, to be honest with you, sort of leaning into the future to be able to figure out how to take and gain advantage and enhance those experiences to be able to take them to our clients so that they can sort of punch through the noise.
Hmm.
And storytelling comes, in many different ways, for each medium, to be honest with you. So, whatever the big idea is, how does that translate into the specific channels that make sense against the audiences that you're trying to reach? And then what is that new way in which you can pull a piece of technology into the equation to make your brand stand out?
Can you illustrate anything by way of example?
There's some simple things that we would do, like it's from a few years ago, but it was like reverse engineering search query based content.
Okay,
So
what? Wait, what
yeah,
now?
yeah, yeah. So we like so imagine this, and again, it's a simple idea. You can either choose to place your communication in a manner that you believe makes sense against sort of paid media opportunities, or you can listen to communities and you can listen to questions that are being asked, and then find your place in the answer of that question. So if, say, an awful lot of people are asking, like, how do I take a photo in low light with a certain piece of technology, and no brand is stepping in to be able to communicate how to do that clearly, you can easily analyze what sort of like the ethos is that's out there in the consumer universe to be able to step in to provide value against the
Uh-huh.
things that people are trying to do. And if those two things connect between the broader brand position and the purpose, and then you stepping forward with the ability to answer those questions that ladder up into that, then you can easily give a consumer a very, very simple frame for being able to do the thing that they're trying to do. And then you slot in your product as a mechanism for being able to achieve that. So it's things like that,
Mhm.
I think, are sort of emblematic of how we try to approach the work that we do.
And that sounds like the word you used in your session, a playbook.
Yeah.
So not plug and play because it's very customized, but you're definitely using your listening skill
Yeah.
to apply that across different platforms. Awesome. I get it now. Any other just cool technologies that are blowing you out of the water these days that we either should fear or don't fear embracing?
Yeah. Well, so at the core, I'm a glass half full versus half
Okay.
empty person. So I have a tendency to look towards emerging technology with bright eyes versus sort of diminished or slightly scary perspectives. That doesn't mean that everything will work out the way that we think or thought by any means.
Mhm.
But the place that I think is most interesting for creatives per se is definitely mixed reality. And I think, once you start to wrap your head around that from a creative playground and how you might tell stories in a world that sort of is built as you move through various different worlds, whether they're real or not, is kind of
Yeah.
insane. It's going to be a lot of fun to figure out like how to do that in a manner that is meaningful.
Do you think we'll lose our humanity or cease learning how to interact
Oh,
within?
here's the thing, right? Like, so you and I, you could have a conversation with one of these,
Hmm.
and we would be
That would be
looking
the
at
phone.
it. Yeah, we would be
Hmm.
looking at it, right? Whereas if you have these, or even better, you
Like your
have like,
Ray-Ban Meta.
yeah, or like just, miniature versions of Orion or miniature versions of Snap spectacles, the form factor gets to this
Okay.
degree, or even a contact lens. There's a company in it's called Expansia that's making a contact lens, so like you could just wear those. Then the benefit is you and I are just looking at each other.
Hmm.
Our head is not in a screen. We're looking at one another, but then there's an overlay of information. So I actually think it will return us to some level of connection. Now, it might have a awful lot of instrumented information layered on top, but at least we'll be looking at each other versus our screen.
Fascinating. So almost in
Yeah,
a holographic come to life kind of way. So
yeah,
not in this little box
yeah,
or just in the ear, but visually depicted.
yeah. If you want to learn about the subjects, again, the Snap Spectacle came out. It was a Snap
Ah,
Summit, and got
okay.
to play around with it. It's definitely Gen 1, Gen 2 ish.
Yeah.
Obviously the advances in that space will be considerable. And then, like I said, about a week later, I was at Meta Connect, and Zuckerberg came out on stage with the Orion, which obviously is a fairly significant investment. That's still prototype. I didn't get a chance to try those.
Hmm.
But, everybody's racing towards that reality. Even, Apple got in on the game earlier this year with the AVP. So you can start to see sort of the cultural ratcheting towards spatial computing, mixed reality as a model for us to all move towards, hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years.
Boy, this seems like a wide open question too, but what kind of advice for those entering the creative field now would you offer?
Well, there's a few things. I think historically, the way that you may have entered into the industry was sort of like with a slightly more technical bend, if I might say that, which is like you would be very good at the tools and the apps, and then you would move through the organization, elevating sort of more of your conceptual perspective. And I'm not so sure that is going to be the case moving forward. primarily because the tools themselves are getting simpler and simpler and simpler. So there's this notion of sort of like low code, no code modeling as well
Yeah.
as automation. I think a good example of this at Max was Adobe has a fairly complex end-to-end system called Gen Studio, which is at scale for large agencies or large organizations to use. But they launched a sort of more simplified version of it called Gen Studio for performance marketing. And it took a lot of the complexity that would have once been part of the equation of creating emails or ad units,
Mhm.
etc., and made it really simple to the point where a marketer could use it, right? Like,
Marketer like me.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, honestly, it's
Wow.
like super simple. You just like you pull from these asset files. It'll write copy from you for based on like style structures that were already built in. So
Yeah.
it's all brand compliant. The list, it's got brand checks in it. The list kind of goes on. So it's just like you press a few buttons and there you go. So I think the future is a lot more simplified. And so you take these massively complex things and you simplify them down so everybody can use them. But like I
Yes.
said, the counterpoint to that is for what reason, right? So you still got to focus in
Okay.
on the big idea, and the big idea has to work in these new emerging mediums where narratives aren't as linear as they once were. It's a lot more like game design where stories can unfold, but they're sort of like pick your own adventure.
So you almost have to be, as an up and coming creative, or to be the next Anthony Yell,
Mm.
a prompt engineer on steroids to
Yeah,
really
well,
understand what to ask and what to try to get extracted
yeah, yeah,
from
yeah.
people.
Well, I said last year I was like, prompts are the new paintbrush. I took that back, to be honest with you, because I was
Oh
like,
yeah.
well, I think prompting is probably always going to be part of it, but I think there's other ways in which you can get things to make the things that you want. So I definitely think prompting is definitely going to be a core part of it. But again, I think, like look at Photoshop, right, or Illustrator. They're quite complicated tool sets,
Yes.
and you've got to learn how to use them to be able to create within them. But then like the counterpoint to that is like Adobe Express, which is really simplified. So I see more things going towards sort of Express models or Gen Studio for performance marketing. So then the tools again become simpler to use. You don't have to be so technically proficient with them, but you still have to understand conceptually what they're capable of doing so
Right.
that you can generate big and better thoughts from them.
So
Does that make sense?
I think it does. And
Yeah.
let me see if we can apply it to that example that I gave you about the Gen Zers aiming for less screens with the
Right.
analog watches.
Yeah.
So with your creators that you're embracing,
Yeah.
um, to send them out as the army for brand messaging,
Yeah.
um, there's definitely a pushback against inauthenticity
Yep.
in a lot of their, TikTok videos or
Yeah.
whatever it is. So I don't know, that almost seems like a conflict
Mm.
between being more organic and yet leveraging these tools that are doing a lot of the implementation for you. Not
Yeah.
sure what I'm asking, but maybe it's
Well,
something you can
well,
speak to.
if you're a creator,
Yeah.
you're like a little media entity. I mean, I love it. I'm so impressed in general. It's just an amazing time to watch like so many people become incredibly powerful creative entities. It's amazing. But like half the time they're editing. You know what I mean? They're having to use complex tools to edit versus
Uh-huh.
create the content. So if the tools themselves get so simplified where the technical requirements of them gets compressed, then they're freed up to think of more compelling stories to communicate, more
Mm.
compelling ideas to present to the world. For creators, when they're engaging with their audiences, it can
Yeah.
be very time consuming, especially if you're very, very successful and you have a lot of subs and followers. You want to engage with them to keep them frankly happy, to be honest with you, and connecting with them because they're obviously incredibly important to you. But that can be massively time consuming. So now you can actually have sort of a digital twin of yourself that can sort of be a mirror of you and address your audiences so that you can be doing some other things. So that's another example of sort of a way in which the tools are getting simpler, expanding the capabilities of you so that you can focus on maybe more important stuff.
Yeah, I'm intrigued and terrified, as I think many of us are these days,
Right.
especially when I look at things like Notebook LM, which is doing a really terrific job of taking text and turning it into, heaven help me, a podcast.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah.
And then, it opens up a whole other set of issues, which I talk about in an episode I'll link to about AI not too long ago and the legal implications of that virtual twin being able to do a pickup when the celebrity is off shooting something in London and they have to be in a studio in New York. Well, assign it to their virtual twin, whatever.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, so many different things. We could go on and on.
But like the thing is though, like we've lived in a world where I think we're already somewhat normalized to it, to be honest with you, right? Like CGI effects within movies.
Yes.
Right.
True.
Been around forever and ever. Like if you happen to like Tron Legacy, there was the younger version of Jeff Bridges. It was like full CG. People just enjoyed the story arc and the narrative. And you could only do that in a more meaningful and realistic way by, strangely enough, sort of deep faking Jeff Bridges as a younger person.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I think it's kind of already everywhere. So yeah, I am equally curious as to some of the legal aspects of it, though.
Well, you've been a great contribution to an ocean of knowledge that we need to learn to navigate. And it's been really, really helpful and really thought-provoking. And you lived up to your promise of addressing brand purpose and listening and almost giving me a Vulcan mind meld. So, Anthony Yell, Chief Creative Officer at Razorfish, thank you so much for sharing your brain and your ideas and your experience with us.
No worries. Thank you.
Well, I hope you got some good insider scoop from this episode of Insider Interviews with me, E.B. Moss. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/mossappeal. And I hope you'll follow Insider Interviews on social media and let me know if you have a question or a suggestion for a next stellar guest in media, marketing, and advertising. Speaking of stellar, my theme music was composed and performed by the incomparable Grammy-winning John Clayton. If I can help you with your company's podcast, please find me at mossappeal.com. Thanks again for listening.